So like I said, we're talking about very uplifting subjects: sadness and grief, despair and loneliness.
Oh.
Although I got to tell you that when Joni and I read together these chapters, after the sadness and grief thing, I did feel uplifted. The take on sadness and grief, the idea of what it was and the power of that surprised me. But then I thought about my experience because, you know, part of my job is being there in the midst of sadness and grief. And I've realized that when you're there, you do have the potential of shifting to that which gives you the best vision of life. So I want you to think back through your life and think of some of those places you've gone through, and how did they change you for the better? What are some of the spaces you remember that way?
Well, okay. I'll start.
Go ahead.
Because when I was 7 years old, we lost our house to fire. That was in December. And the following December, when I was 8, my father died unexpectedly. And that's why we moved to Arizona, to be near another family member. But what I remember is, and it was just, I mean, it was lose your house, lose your father. But what I remember is the lesson my mother taught me was, even in the worst of times, you don't stop living, you keep moving forward. And that was one of the most powerful lessons I learned from her. And I've always, since then, it's like I always look to the sunny side of the street. I always, in awful situations, I can always find some little light, whether it's in my life or that I can share with somebody else. It was a powerful lesson.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that, Garnet. How about the rest of you?
Okay. It's actually the most life-changing experience that I've ever had. After 35 years of a marriage that was really frozen, my wife never once told me what she liked or didn't like about anything. No opinions about a movie, television set, an article, or anything else. Never told me why she was mad at me. Because she had been so wounded as a person with a hair up and kept proud up in the first 30 years of her life. Anyway, I wrote letters every week. I was gone about 80 to 100 hours a week working. But I wrote long letters to her every single week. And I found out in our 35th year, she'd never read past the first paragraph of the first letter. I was so astonished and so wounded that I couldn't feel anything for about 2 or 3 weeks. I just shut down. And I mean, I'd been grieving for this marriage for 35 years. And this showed me there was absolutely no hope for ever resurrecting or salvaging anything from it. So I've been a fixer all my life, trying to fix myself, fix other people. When I came out of that in about 3 weeks, it felt like I gave up, but I think what happened is I gave up trying to fix things. I just let things be. And I was astonished. It was a different world. Nothing needed to change. I just let things be and everything was fine.
Yeah. Thank you. When Joni and I first met, she was living in an apartment complex, and across the way is where Miss Kravitz lived. And Miss Kravitz had 2 kids, Joe and Andrew. And Joe, when he was 6, was killed in an accident. It was a tough thing for us to get through. That happened just about the time that I was starting off to seminary. and how he changed me. His death was, as I was in Sun City dealing with a bunch of 80 and 90-year-old people facing death, having faced Joe's death gave me a space to be able to talk to them about that, to be in that space with them. And so as hard as what it was to lose Joe, the voice that he gave me, the song that he placed in my heart, allowed me to be able to speak to those folks who were facing death as I'd never seen it before. And so that sadness, that grief, was a building block for me to be able to be the pastor that I am today. Essential block.
My mother died 26 years ago. She had a brain tumor, and when she was diagnosed, it was 9 months, and then she died. And it was, you know, like a little baby. You know, it takes 9 months before you're out. And I kind of felt that way about her. It was a loss, I mean, it was expected, but it was still, she was my mother, you know, so it was really hard to lose her. But I was a caregiver for her for about 10 days, lived with her, and then I had a lot of other people helping. I wrote, and that helped me a lot during that time, to journal and to write poetry about my mother that I still have and reflect on. But, you know, the Dalai Lama talks about in Buddhism, the detachment, and how everything is ephemeral, that it'll be there and then it'll be gone, everything. And so that was kind of the first big death in my life was my mother, but it was one of, now, you know, many. And you realize, like my grandfather said, you know, death is a part of life. And so you sort of have to expect it and accept it, So you do become like, you know, people that have experienced loss, they're more sympathetic and compassionate to those that are also going through that, because you've been there, you know those feelings.
Right.
So, yeah.
That's why I like this quote that was there. I would say go ahead and maybe even shout out your sadness and pain. And very often when we're going through grief, we like to hide away. And yet somebody, I think, this is what Joe's death told me at least, somebody needs to hear that same thing. When he died, I wrote a song that Joe's playing with the angels, right? And I'm amazed how often that has been the song I've needed and wanted to sing in the midst of other deaths, so that other people could hear that same thing about the one they lost. I think it's good for us to sing our sadness and pain, to be in that space where we let it be even in the pain, a joyful sound in the life of someone else. I think, in fact, sadness and pain deepen our grief. Deepen our joy, because it gives a dimension to it that nothing else can. If everything is wonderful and hunky-dory through your life, you don't have much depth to that joy. But being able to find strength in the midst of something that is not easy, not wanted, then something different happens to the joy that you have.
So you think it also is an expression of the love you have for that person? That if you didn't feel anything, then you didn't have much of a relationship with them.
Yeah, later on in the chapter, if you remember, they say something like, grief is the reminder of the depth of your love.
I like that.
One of the things I typically say around death is, you know, the reason you're hurting is because of love. That person loved you and you loved them. because somebody else died today and you don't know a thing about them. It doesn't matter to you at all. And it's nice to know that I'm here, tears in my eyes, because this person did something amazing for me, to me, right? And the deeper the relationship is, sometimes the harder the grief is, right? So what gifts has your sadness brought to you? What are the things that you are today because you passed through that veil of tears? Something that you may not have had if you hadn't gone through that.
I think that the thing that came to my mind, a couple events that popped in that I've been kind of comparing, but when I was 16, my parents got divorced. And I had an older sister who was 18, who was old enough to be on her own, had a little sister who was 14 that my mom made go with her. My mom relocated to California and my dad moved to Texas. And here I was in the middle. And so they kind of just said, well, what do you want to do? And I decided to stay in Arizona. And that brought a lot of struggles in my life. But I think looking back now, many, many, many years later, it has given me an appreciation for family, because my sisters and I did not, basically finish growing up together. We've been apart all of our lives since that event. So it really has made me, want to have those close relationships with my sisters and my family.
Thank you, Joe. How about the rest of you? What gifts has your sadness brought to you?
I guess,
Wait.
go ahead, Nancy.
Well, I was just going to say, there's a closeness that develops with my sisters because we all felt the same love and the same sadness.
Mhm.
And so we connected. They were the ones who told me. They called me and told me my mom died.
Mm.
And they're older. They're 8 and 9 years older, so I'm really the baby. But that brought a bridge between the three of us that we never really had before. Because they, like Joni, they left. My sister was married and had a baby when I was 12. So they're both more like aunts than sisters because of that age gap. But yeah, I still have a closeness, and we still talk about my mom and dad in ways that only siblings can do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And it's sadness of all different sorts. If you've ever gone through a divorce can break you in a lot of ways, but it can also help turn you into a whole different person as you move forward in life, both with whoever you choose next, but also in the ways that you sit with other people that are going through the same type of thing. Because divorce can be one of those things that's very isolating, and once you've gone through it, you're more likely to be present for someone else that's going through that time.
And that kind of ties into what I was going to share because of the sadness and loss that I went through as such a young child. It has given me, well, and even as an adult too, it has given me a skill to interact with some of my friends, and I'm specifically thinking of a particular client of mine who was just devastated about a loss that happened to her neighbor's husband and wife that were killed by a grandson. And she was just bawling her whole treatment, and I could be there for her in her grief and support her in her grief, and in the same respect saying, if he had lived and she had died, he would never have been happy. And if she had lived and he had died, And I said, they are still together, they are together, and that grandson will never be able to kill somebody else again unless it's in prison, but it's, just to be there in somebody's deep grief and know that you empathize, you've been there, and you survived, and she will too, or they will too.
What was interesting here, though, too, is that they also, in the midst of this, said that it goes beyond just some of those empathetic things. At one point, it said that they did a series of experiments, if you remember, and people who were in a sad mood had better judgment, better memory, and were more motivated, more sensitive to social norms, more generous than the happier control group. They were more discerning about their situation, better able to remember details, and more motivated to change the situation. We should be sadder more often. I mean, look at all those gifts that are in there. Why is it that being in that space makes us all those different things? How does it help us to turn that way?
Well, even now with the pandemic, we're all kind of sad about this. It's within one day, I'll be happier than other times of the day, and I think I'll watch the news and get all bummed out, or I look at the mountains and the fires and I'm sad by all of that. And then, it's also given me a lot of time for creativity and relaxing in ways I wouldn't do. So it's a mixed bag. It's, the other side of the coin, like we've been talking about.
Yeah. The hard part is that we've all been taught to a certain degree that emotions are either good emotions or bad emotions, right? And when I listed all those today, sadness, grief, loneliness, I'm sure we all automatically put them into the range of bad emotion, right? Especially if we had somebody in our past, one of the adult figures in our past, who said, don't cry, big boys don't cry type of thing, or don't do this, don't act this way, then it was really easy for us to classify those in that space. But at the same time, doing that takes away, according to these experiments especially, some of that which brings us to the better side of us, if we allow that to happen. So let's go to the other two things and see if we can find the same type of thing there. The next chapter was on despair. Okay, that space, not just of grief, but of looking at the world and going, what the hell is this? There's a bit of that going on right now, isn't there? In a lot of different ways. Can we, in the midst of despair, find a way to take that emotion and have it be something of blessing to us? And how do we get there?
Well, that was pretty much my life. I was good. I earned a PhD in victimhood in the first 60 years of my life. I was good at it. Nobody would have could have possibly convinced me that life didn't have it in for me, no matter what kind of evidence they gave me.
Uh-huh.
And my marriage was part of that. I think the benefit that seems to have come out of that is that I have much more empathy and lack of disdain for other people that are in pain and that see themselves as beaten down or such. In fact, that's my best connection with Trump. Man, this guy, he knows how to play the victim. And, I can understand that, that he must have, I'm imagining he had a very deprived childhood and that he's really been suffering all his life from it. And all of these outer actions of bullying others and and lying and creating a fantasy world and all are issuing from that. And I can understand where he's coming from my own experience with that. So in those ways, I can be more compassionate, more forgiving.
Thank you. So my moment of greatest despair, I was in my late 20s. Everything was going to hell in a handbasket. And Super Bowl Sunday, because my friend Craig had invited me out to his house to watch Super Bowl. So I was driving out that way, and you go over this ridge and then up the canyon. And as I'm driving over this ridge, I realized the thing I wanted to do most in the moment of despair that I was in is drive off the side.
Mm-hmm.
And what took me just a few minutes to get out there took me a couple hours to get back home. And in the midst of that terrible, agonizing, nothing is right moment, I called a friend of mine named Dana. And in that moment, Dana spoke something besides just the despair, was present in a way that said that there's some type of something beyond this. Now later what I realized is that she gave me hope, because she allowed me to see some flickering of something that wasn't present in myself. It wasn't present in what was going on inside of my heart, my spirit. I think that's the gift of despair, is to somehow know that there's something more, even though. How is it that you got through some of the darkest moments? What gave you that flicker of possibility? And how does that then continue today in your life, because you knew in that darkest moment that it wasn't the only truth?
I feel like what makes it so hard now with all the things going on in the world is isolation does not help despair. That normally if a friend is struggling, you go to them. You know, if someone's sick, you run to them. You know, we reach out and help each other. And we aren't doing that now, or we can't do that now. And I think that really complicates the world right now.
Yeah, it does. Hope is almost by definition a communal space, right? It's something that we find in each other and through each other, and being able to see through another person's eyes when your own eyes only see so far. And you're right, that when we're apart, forced apart like this, it makes it challenging to do that. But I think it also reminds us of how important it is to find that next piece, that next possibility. So in my interactions with Cousin Bob and others, right, I find myself trying to act differently, to be able to say, you know what, maybe I don't need to put one more brick on their load. Can I, in the midst of this space of despair, find ways to lighten the moment in some way or another? Help the moment. I still argue with them, right? But I find myself a bit different. Did I tell you about the conversation I had with the friend of the cousin of my cousin? Did I tell you about that? Okay, so Bob's my cousin. Dean is his cousin on the other side, right? And so I'm in a conversation with Dean. Dean is a social worker down in the panhandle of Florida. 20-year veteran military. Definitely has a typical conservative viewpoint of things. So I argue with him on a pretty regular basis. But as we're arguing this time, a guy chimes in named Ettor, E-T-T-O-R. And we got into the best conversation, an amazing conversation that was edifying for both of us. And then towards the end, we happened to notice that we both live in Tucson. So I don't know what will come of that. But in the midst of argument, but openness to each other, something changed. Something was different. And hope was given in the midst of the obvious roadblocks that are in front of us right now, and different answers about how to get past those roadblocks. So at the end of the chapter, he said something like this: resignation and cynicism are easier and more soothing postures that do not require the raw vulnerability and tragic risk of hope. To choose hope is to step firmly forward into the howling wind, bearing one's chest to the elements, knowing that in time the storm will pass. We do a lot of protecting ourselves from the storm, don't we? How do we help each other to walk boldly into it, knowing that the storm is not going to be the last word, that it's really, truly not? Because I see a lot of people speaking the storm's power, don't you? How do we help people to see beyond the storm? What are you doing actively, either to listen for that in others or to give that to others?
I have, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, this is Jade, by the way, who's not seeable, I guess.
All right.
I have a thing when I go to talk to people. I say, well, and just almost like I meet someone and whatever. You know, this year, let's look at ourselves. We've gone through a pandemic. We've gone through social unrest. We've had food shortages. We've had a natural disaster, a fire, and it's only June. Just think about what we got left the rest of the year. And that's how they react. But it kind of like, you know, it almost is like, okay, good for us. Look what we've survived so far.
Yeah. And I think that's always helpful, because I think sometimes when you're facing bam, 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 you think you can't get through it. And just have somebody just whisper in your ear, you've done so much so far, keep going. All right? Just that bit of good job, attaboy.
Yeah. You know, like, because it's like, it is June.
It is June. And we've done this. And
Yeah.
and we know it's not over, but we've done a lot.
Yes, yes.
And the joy of Christmas is exactly 6 months from today.
6 months. And the joy of the holiday after Christmas is 6 months from tomorrow.
Very good.
That's Joni's birthday, for anyone who doesn't know.
Oh, good. I didn't know that. You know, I think though that kind of affirmation and support you can give to someone else, it takes so little and it means so much.
Yeah.
You know, I just need one little sentence from a friend or a sister, like you said, you know, keep going, you're doing great. That's all I needed. And then I'm great for the rest of the evening.
Yeah.
The other thing that helps me though is silence and being alone, praying and meditating, and also a mantra when I was going through my mother's dying. It was, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me.
Uh-huh.
And I repeat that a lot, and it really became just a part of myself. And I felt that.
Yeah.
So those are things that have helped me
So
to be
is the mantra a similar type of thing for you as the slow down, center yourself type of thing, or is it different? Because it sounds like the one was really a find a calm space in the midst of the storm within you. Is the mantra the same thing, or is it different for you?
the Bible verse that I read.
Yeah, the Bible verse.
You know, I felt comforted by it.
Okay.
I felt,
Okay.
yeah, and that is a different feeling than peace.
Yeah. Yeah.
It was comforting to acknowledge the mystery of life and the life force and our existence, our very existence, and why we're born here with these people, and we're all living in Tucson together. I mean, it's like, wow, it's beyond me. I don't get it. So I let go and let God. It's become maybe said too often, but it's still very true for me.
Nice.
To give it over to a bigger power than what I can't control the fire or the pandemic.
Yeah.
Or the social injustice, but I can have love in my heart for those that are trying, and to, you know, the firefighters, and, you know, all the other things that are going on. I can support it with money and encouragement and prayers for them.
But I think at least part of what you're talking about, Nancy, is that in the midst of despair, we have got to find a larger definition of myself, who I am. And it is in community, I think, that we find some of that. That you're right. Yesterday, Joni and I drove up on the other side of the mountain and saw the fires from that direction. And they are way beyond our control, right? We can't solve that. But we also talked on the way about how there's some people who know an awful lot that are doing remarkable things up there, right? And that I can trust that larger definition of me. But think about that in the other places of your life. When you were struggling with death, when you were struggling with divorce, when you were struggling with whatever it was that was too much for you, who became a companion on that journey for you? Who spoke the word that helped you to go forward? Who was your Dana who spoke into your despair?
Well, I often think that just having faith in a higher power is really what gives me the strength to keep going. It's not a specific person necessarily. I mean, I think God uses different people to speak to me, but I often think about people with no faith and how they handle life's struggles, because we all have them.
But just what you just said, Joe, may be part of that answer, though. That person who doesn't have faith, if you read a book about atheism, and I've got a couple in here if you want to read it, often they're not saying, I don't believe in anything. They're saying, I don't believe in the makeups of that the way you do. They often speak a very deep faith, but not a faith in outside intervention, right? In that type of a higher power. They speak it sometimes in terms of community. Sometimes they speak it in terms of what has civilization done that has brought us forward to this space. So they have a faith that's just differently based than what religion faith is. Does that make sense? And so it gives them hope in the same way, but through different means.
Yeah. I've had a couple of conversations with atheists, and it turned out that I don't believe in the kind of God they don't believe in either.
Yeah. So let's go to our third thing, which is loneliness. And what I was struck with this is the sense of what happens in loneliness. That you can be with 1 million people and be lonely, or you can be alone and not alone, not lonely. What is it that causes us to be lonely versus alone? What is the key element there?
I think it's about feeling supported. If you can be around a lot of people, but if they don't know what's going on with you, and they maybe know what's going on with you, but they're afraid to talk, and so you don't have the support and a pedestal to step up, get up off the floor and be above where you were. And yeah, I remember a doctor a long time ago asking me if I felt, by being by myself, if I felt lonely, and I said, I'm alone, but I'm not lonely. And I said, in the times I have felt alone, I've usually been in a crowd of people.
We're in a relationship. I've been in a relationship where I've been.
Not presently.
No. I know where I'm really lonely in that relationship, and I've been alone, and it's just different. It's,
Yeah, I think
It's
sometimes lonely. Well, go ahead.
I was just going to say, like, when you're alone and you feel lonely, you understand why.
Yeah.
You're in a relationship and you feel lonely, it doesn't make sense.
Yeah, because I think loneliness in a relationship has more to do with things like abandonment type of sense, right? Somehow being left when you shouldn't have been left, right? Hurt when you should have been loved, something along those lines. So it's the where the emotions that should have been there don't jive up with what is actually happening.
I think I felt lonely when someone, through my life, either through my family has almost disowned me or didn't want to have anything to do with me, or I've had someone take a malicious action toward me for no reason but their own unhealthiness.
Yeah.
Down to it, but that really, I felt shocked and at the same time extremely hurt and lonely.
Yeah. The coming out process, Jade, as I've talked to friends of mine, it's much like that. They go to their mom, their dad, that person that has said I love you, and they speak these words, these coming out words, and when the parents take exactly the opposite of what it seems should happen, leave you in that space of loneliness. When it's rejection that happens at that moment, just that juxtaposition of what should have been versus what was true in that moment. And they often, because of that, speak of deep moments of depression and loneliness as they try to fit back into what could have happened.
Right.
Yeah, it seems like most of my life, up to age 60, I felt like I was a totally isolated person. It felt like when I watched others in life, like I was pressing my nose and my fingers to the window pane, looking at life going on out there, while I was all by my lonesome. Toward the end, in fact, from 50 to 60, I think I went through about 7 suicide attempts in desperation. So, yeah, the sense of extreme isolation, that marriage I was in for 35 years was by far the time I felt most acutely how alone I was.
Yeah.
And the funny thing is, I've really not had that many opportunities to connect with people. But it seems inconceivable to me now that I could be lonely.
Right.
I just feel the connections. And whether I get to make the connections physically or not really isn't an issue.
But I would venture to say that it's that feeling the connections. I think as we've talked about some of the stuff that's given you meaning in your life, Ed, it feels like much of that has to do with the connectedness between us as human beings, or as a human being in different bodies, maybe, right? And it's that interconnectedness that I think is the antidote to loneliness, to know that we are truly and wholly part of each other, right? That even as the Dalai Lama said, we are same human being. Even though I look across and see a different human being, to think that we are same, that there is something there. And he goes on to say, no need for introduction. Well, we all know that's not quite true, but in the reality is I can look at that other human being that I don't know at all and still feel a connectedness, can't I? And we do sometimes.
Well, I wanted to say a couple things. One, to add, when you talk about your despair, it's hard for me to understand it when I hear your prayers, because you're such a great prayer giver, and you're so sensitive and sweet to the way you observe the world around you and in you, that I know it was a difficult time, but you have reaped rewards by somehow or other, because your prayers indicate that.
Sure, but it goes back to that sense of sadness. In sadness, we go to a depth that allows us to be very different than what we would have at any other time.
Yeah.
And we get to carry that forward.
I have no regrets about. I can remember all the bad stuff, but I can't remember the feelings. They don't come up anymore. That's not a broken record. Right. And it's I feel like I've been living an entirely different life now. So and I have no regrets about what it took to get to me where I am.
Yeah. But it does take, I think, time to be able to discover that. And that's what I think what we give to each other in being present for each other in the midst of those times. Because here's the one thing I've learned. I can't solve anybody's grief, right? It is something that they have to journey through, right? It's not a solvable issue. They have to figure out the new way to understand the one that was dear to them, and get from one side of loss to the side of newness on the other side of it somehow. But I can be with them. I can assure them that they're not alone in that journey.
Yeah.
And sometimes you never know when it is that you're doing that. It might just be the person that you just happen to wave to, not because you really know them, but you're just being friendly for a second. Right? And maybe that gives them just enough of not loneliness that they get past whatever the loneliness is that's there. Maybe it's the clerk at the Circle K that you just say hi to every single day. And so they know that at least you're there. One of the, oh, go ahead.
I met a man today that I didn't really meet him, but we were standing waiting, and we both had masks on, and here's this total stranger, like you were saying, going through, he went on and on about what's going on, and I did too. We were dialoguing with a total stranger, expressing our despair and amazement and sadness. And he'd been a coach, and he goes, I can't coach football anymore for at least a year. And he was like divulging these pretty sensitive feelings to a stranger. And sometimes it's easier, isn't it, with a stranger than it is with someone who knows you, because they might make some comment, whereas a stranger, they're usually nice enough just to shut up and listen.
A few years ago, I had a good friend of mine come and speak here. He used to be district superintendent, actually, in the South District. But we met when he was the senior pastor, and I was his associate up at First Church Phoenix. His name is Buzz. And he wrote a book. I was just trying to find it for you. I will find it for you if you want to do it. But he wrote a book that is basically about these small momentary encounters, right? And the depth that you can go to in those. The guy that you have to sit next to on the plane.
Yes.
And in that 1 hour, 2 hour flight allows you to do something that maybe you couldn't do with someone you've known your whole life. The people that are just glances in, passerby in the night, but that somehow tell you that there's something there in spite of what you think is real relationship. And his whole point is that it does not take years to develop true relationship, that you can sometimes do it in those momentary spaces.
Yep, I've experienced that.
And so it's a remarkable book, and he has a whole bunch of different examples for him of how that happens. So if you'd like to borrow that book, I'll get it for you. So for the Archbishop and the Dalai Lama, it has a lot to do with interdependence. That knowing or not knowing each other is not the point. That there's something about that other person that I'm beholden to, something about me that they're beholden to. That we're already connected, we're already dependent on each other, but we just don't know it. Right? The stranger you pass by on the street may be the guy who is your garbage collector, right? And we often don't want to acknowledge that we really need a garbage collector, but we all do, don't we? Right? And who else is unknown to you, but is very connected to your life? You know, who's the guy who puts the bread in your grocery store that you buy? Who's the person who cooks at the restaurant you go to, because you see the waitress, but oftentimes you don't see the one who cooks the food. And all those relatively invisible people are very important to us, even when we don't acknowledge it. So who today did you have to deal with who maybe you didn't know you needed? And it could have been good. It could have been a good interaction, or like Joni was a bad interaction where she had to wait forever for somebody to do something, but she needed their help. Right, Joe?
Yes, I knew you were thinking about that. So I was on the phone for an hour waiting for customer service, who then just told me, I can't do anything, call back tomorrow. So I'm not sure what that connection was.
Yeah, it's not quite a thank you yet.
Didn't feel like it.
Yeah. And yet we all have people like that that are there somewhere in our life. Sometimes it's just the guy who made sure the traffic light works so that I don't have to worry about going through. Right?
And you know, Jim, it's the other way around too. As a teacher, you have no idea what little things you've done, good or bad, that stay with a person or people.
That's right.
And you'll never know how. And you know, you might see them in Costco, and they'll say, "Oh, I remember you said blah blah blah," and you're like, "Really? I said that?"
Yeah. And you know what, Nancy? Sometimes it's not even that close. Sometimes it's because the kid that you said XYZ to mentioned it to somebody else, and they said XYZ to somebody else. And so what you said wasn't even your own teaching, but it was the teaching of the teaching of the teaching that somehow comes back and blesses you. And it's that interconnectedness, that interdependence that we, especially in America, where we do a whole bunch of, I did it by myself, pulled myself up by my own bootstraps, that we forget how much we truly need each other and how much we are absolutely inextricably dependent on each other.
And what was that movie that we liked? And I can never think of the name of it. It's one word, but it was really about how everyone bumped into someone else and their interaction. What is it?
Crash.
Have you guys seen that movie Crash before?
Yes, yes.
Always
It's
intriguing. If you haven't seen it, tell them a little bit about it.
yeah, it's a great movie. All kinds of stars in it. Each one playing a part of a role, and each one being good and bad in different ways. Different ways of crashing lives. Sometimes physical car crashes, but other times just emotional crashes of one sort. But how they are in very real ways connected to one another.
And kind of that ripple effect of how you bump into someone may cause them. I show my kids the black and white little cartoon about, someone bumps into someone and knocks their suitcase down, or anyway, at the end, they each help each other, and then there's love in the world, and it turns into a kind of colored cartoon. And I mean, there's no words spoken, but the kids totally get that each person's interaction affected how they then reacted to the next situation.
That's right. And which goes to one of my favorite sayings in this whole section. He said, open-heartedness, warm-heartedness is the antidote to loneliness. That somehow in every single moment, just to be able to be open and warm towards that other person, and to receive openness and warmth from that other person helps a lot. 2 years ago, I went on a trip by myself. Well, I didn't start off that way. I brought a whole bunch of people down to Peru and went to the refuge and showed them around the refuge. We had a great time. And then I got them to Lima and said, get on a plane and leave me alone. And I went off by myself up to northern Peru, alone. And what was really interesting is I met up with this family. Monica, who is a lady from Maryland, but her mom, La Abuela, is from Lima. And so she was here visiting her mom and had brought her 2 kids with her, and they decided to go visit the same place I was. And so we just saw each other a couple times, and then we ended up on touring one of the big things in the same group, but then we ended up on the same van getting us back up to the airport. And I didn't know them from Adam, right? Chances are I'll never see them again. And yet they made this space of where I was off by myself, alone, into a not lonely space. That in that space, there was still that to which I was connected. And I think we all need to know that. That even in those spaces where we are alone, we need to have connection. And much of it came down to all 4 of them being open and warm-hearted. So where can you be that? How can you be that in your world? I look at Nancy. She's, a guide up at Sabino Canyon, and there's nobody at Sabino Canyon right now, right? And,
Right.
and sometimes the people, though, who go to Sabino Canyon, they want to be left alone, right? They don't want a guide. They don't want you to show them around. But it doesn't mean you can't be present with them somehow. At one point he says, we do not have to wait for others to open their hearts to us. By opening our hearts to them, we could feel connected to them, whether on a mountaintop or in the middle of Manhattan. As you walk through your world, are you walking through your world essentially sending out a prayer of love to every single person you meet? Do they feel some strand of good spirit flowing towards them from you, even if they don't recognize it's from you? Because it might make all the difference in the world to them. Sadness, grief, despair, loneliness, all those things we'd rather avoid, we think are good to not have. As I've gone through them myself, I've realized people have always been there for me, and it reminds me to try to be there for someone else in the midst of. My sadness has given me empathy. My grief, my despair has given me hope. My loneliness has shown connection to other people. And those gifts are gifts we can continue to show to others every single day. Any last words?
I feel like it's, and I don't know if anybody else feels this way, I should have more time than ever in my day, but I feel like it's harder for me to reach out to people. And I don't have an answer for that, except that that's just how I'm feeling.
I think all of these emotions, at least part of what they do, these tougher, darker emotions, are ones that do try to isolate us. And they try to tell us a story to continue in that isolation. And yet, what has this is not quite the right word, but what has rescued us in our own dark spaces before has been somebody who stepped towards in some way or another, right? And so I think that that's what we have to figure out how to do, is step towards even when the moment seems to say isolate.
I think the other thing is ask for help. Because sometimes it's very hard for some people.
Yeah. When Dana was there for me, I was the one who made the phone call to her. If she'd known something was going on, she would have called me, I think. But sometimes you have to be able to trust enough in something to say, to step towards, to say, lift me up in this moment, take care of me now.
What do you think made you call her? Like,
I don't even remember right now. I think it was just, there was just something that said, maybe I needed some kind of light. I think it was.
glad she did.
Yeah, me too. Right? But we all have moments like that in all kinds of different ways and of all kinds of different degrees of severity. And somehow life helps us get through those. People help us get through those. And that's what we're trying to discover for each other, from each other as well. So go into your world open-heartedly, warm-heartedly, even in the midst of whatever it is that doesn't speak that to you, and somehow try to go past that isolation and into their life and say, don't worry, you're not alone. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank
We
you.
appreciate you. We appreciate you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank
Have
you
a good week, everybody.